Hi guys, this is Paulo Fosso and I'm here with Ron Edwards, the creator of Sorcerer, co-founder of The Forge, and Wikipedia says game theorist. Hi Ron, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I have no idea what Wikipedia thinks it means. Now, the main thing I want to say, first of all, is that I love role playing. I consider myself a role player, and anything else I do is a subroutine of that. So maybe that will help with a thing or two.
Okay, so your strong impact on the RPG world is undeniable. The Forge helps indie authors to showcase their works and raise awareness around the potential of RPGs. When did you realize you were making a mark in the industry?
All right. This is a two-part answer. The first part is the friendly, anecdotal, heartwarming part that makes everybody happy. Which was from being somebody who had no contact with role playing culture except through local game stores and occasional, conversations. And at that point, the early internet. But I wasn't really hardcore into the early internet in terms of Usenet or similar, huge venues. I had little presence or interest in those communities. So, interacting in a couple of early role playing sites, though, and co founding The Forge was a big change. Up until then, it was just web rings and mailing lists. If anyone out there remembers that stuff. So anyway, what I'm saying is that I had never been to a role-playing convention. The idea of publishing a role-playing game had crossed my mind, of course, but any investigations I had done seemed insurmountable or disastrous, evidently. So therefore, I was very surprised when I actually attended for the first time in 2000 the Gamma Trade Show. Actually, that was in 2001. So in order, Origins and Gen Con in 2000, and then the Gamma Trade Show in 2001. And again, much to my surprise, found that I was not a stranger. That people whose work I had read or certainly had played for quite a long time, many of them knew who I was. And many of them were all about, hey, this is what you do, or don't do this, or go talk to that person, or things like that. And so, therefore, you get this sense of this wonderful thing of how just a little guy in the wonders of the internet can suddenly find themselves embraced by the captains of the industry and becomes part of it all. And all of a sudden, we're Joss Whedon Star Trek fans suddenly, running these science fiction shows and directing movies, and it's this glorious little story that frankly makes me kind of vomit.
Right.
So that's a lovely story, and that we could have checked off the box, and you would have a nice interview piece, and everybody would feel good. But now I'm going to tell you
Second
two, which is that, as I briefly tagged at the beginning, I don't think a role-playing designer is anything but a role player with a personality quirk. Well, that's the best, most positive way I can put it. And that the role-playing publishing is, on the one hand, a remarkable act of communication and shared experience, opportunity, inspiration, spreading across something, taking something very personal and non-commercialized, the act of play, and sharing it about with other people who do that too, and we are examining or encountering different ways.
So today you live in Sweden, and coming to RPGs in Europe, Sweden is one of the main centers. It's very well known in international markets with titles like Mörk Borg, for example. And I think there's no European country that can even get close to Sweden level. Why is that?
Okay, here are my views. The
Uh-huh.
first is that we need to distinguish between two things, which is, uh, well, the gross national product of role playing sales
Mm-hmm.
and publishing is one variable. And from today's perspective, that can be very impressive. Look,
Mm-hmm.
basically, look at how much money they're making. That's one variable or one
Mm-hmm.
lens to look at this through. And another one to examine is what was it like before that rather immense presence commercially.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I'll give credit to the wonderful store, Science Fiction Bokhandeln, which is a chain through
Mm-hmm.
Sweden. And it is now, somebody could tell me about something that I know nothing about that also plays this role. But
Uh-huh.
to my understanding, this is kind of the cultural uh, glue of the
Mm-hmm.
hobby or the activity in Sweden. The people who participated in the opening of the store, people who currently are still in charge of ordering and so forth. These people have very deep roots in role playing here. They
Mm-hmm.
encountered role playing. Just to let you know, the game that really hit Sweden in the early
Mm-hmm.
1980s was the licensed um, British publication of
Mm-hmm.
RuneQuest,
Yeah, I remember that.
and then two very significant ones. First Mutant, and then
Mm-hmm.
later Cult.
Mm-hmm.
All of these were heavily informed, if not identical in system, at least were heavily informed by the way to play that
Mm-hmm.
that form of RuneQuest represented. Because RuneQuest also
Mm-hmm.
has, like all role playing games of that era, has interesting little crisscrossing angles on what it actually was. But the one that sort of showed up in that box set the parameters. And so I'm not saying that all the game design here was imitative, but it had a very distinct and definite starting point
Mm-hmm.
so that modifications are clear modifications or reversals or something of that. So, with
Yeah.
this going on, with the idea that you had this chain of hobbies and bookstores, well, it's a combination, right? Bookstore, coffee shop, comic book store, game store, soon dice, t-shirts, posters. It's
Mm-hmm.
a pop culture venue,
Mm-hmm.
and this
Mm-hmm.
is a country of 9 million people, and so it's not too difficult to understand that the activities of stores or similar stores, plus the very grassroots conventions,
Mm-hmm.
Göteborg, known to most people as
Mm-hmm.
Gothenburg,
All right.
hosts GothCon, which is
Mm-hmm.
held in it looks like a local convention. It's the biggest gaming convention, role playing convention in Sweden, but it is about role playing and a few
Mm-hmm.
associated hobby games. You are not going to see
Wow.
great big media presences. It's not like Luca. You're not going to see
Mm-hmm.
the
Okay.
presence of all these other media there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it still has this very we play games. What are you here for? Sort of feel to it. And
Right.
then even more so for the other known conventions, the one in Linköping,
Mm-hmm.
Lincon, which is just to the south of me, and
Mm-hmm.
a few other things like that. They feel like kind of like if you ever been to a university where a student group puts on a convention, and so everybody just kind of goes to college for a weekend,
Mm-hmm.
sleeps in the gym in their sleeping bags, and there's a bunch of like student recreation rooms or classrooms that have been sort of opened up for people to play games in, that sort of thing. I mean, I like
Right.
it a
Yeah.
lot.
Right.
There's
Right.
a
Right.
lot of people, and there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
games and a lot of things. The cosplaying, all that stuff is happening.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we're talking about a rather understandable and recognizable culture at work, and not just a big piece of pop culture in a broad sense.
Right.
Um,
Right. 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 That's
so
interesting.
yeah, so therefore, what is up with all of this? What is up with all of this going on? Um,
Mm-hmm.
with Sweden sort of Swedish publications suddenly becoming quite, intense. Well, for one thing, a number of smaller groups have become much more active in the last decade and a half. And their dialogue about design and their dialogue about publishing shows a certain influence, I think, or rather, shall we say, a ready response to
Hmm.
the suggestion that you can publish your own work and that this is not amateurish, this is not fake,
Right.
this is not beta, and that
Hmm.
is a Forge thing to say.
Right, 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 right.
Second, that to dig into historical play, to dig into historical designs, to learn to say there are no dead games. I can pick up
Hmm.
a game from 1981 and I can say, I'm playing the hell out of this. Oh, and now I can present some inspirational form of that as my game, right? As whatever it was we ended up doing at the table, I said, oh, I can write that up. That's different. Or I have an idea based from that, and I say, oh, I'm going to use that as a core for such play. That is also the Forge.
Yeah, great. That's
And
right.
so
That's
the
right.
impact of those things, and although they have been, I think, bastardized into marketing terms like indie
Hmm.
or story game
Hmm.
or OSR, much of
Hmm.
which I think are rather meaningless labels, um, but those are the branded terms. Those are the terms that people
Hmm. Yeah, right.
intensely and deliberately, I mean, we can name the names,
Mhm.
very deliberately around 2008 through 2012, turned these into brands and standards and rather hostile in many cases communities
Mhm.
across the internet.
Right,
So this
right,
that
right.
during that period is when those became the expression of things that I think are good, in ways that I don't think are good.
Right,
But
right.
in Sweden, that hit very hard about 15 years ago. 15 to 10 years ago, there was a lot of contention, in the interwebs about all this stuff. There's also the heavy duty LARPing culture here and the
Hmm.
derived
Yeah.
LARPing, what you might think of as LARPing sitting down or a slightly different form or taking the lessons of LARPing into role playing, Yeep form, and a few
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Um, and so there is a lot of that kind of dialogue here, very fertile ground for these discussions.
Hmm.
For whatever reason, perhaps cultural, I don't know, perhaps due more to that economic context of having these rather healthy, in my opinion, rather decent stores, right? A nice place to go. If you walk into
Hmm.
any of these stores, you'll feel comfortable. You'll
Yeah,
grab a
right, right, right.
coffee, you'll play a game.
Mm-hmm.
There's events. You say, "Oh, what events are going on this weekend?" Oh, wow, I can do this
That's
thing,
great.
right? It's
Ah,
nice. And so,
right, right, right.
with that all in place, you can see why. And given the
Mm-hmm.
impact of Forge originated discussion, you can really
Mm-hmm.
see how people would start being entrepreneurial.
No, no, no.
But I think it's
I totally agree. Okay, let me ask you. Some of your games talk about historical, political, social topics, which are far, far distant from horror, fantasy, or sci-fi. Shahida or Spion, for example, include details about civil war in Beirut and secret services during the Cold War. Will people finally legitimize RPGs as a tool to face important topics? Is the market ready? What do you think?
Well, I have no idea what the market thinks it's ready for. I will personally think that the current publishing of role playing is leaning in a very different direction. It's leaning very much into licensing, celebrity showcasing.
Mm.
There will be 2, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 before we see a movie which purports to be, integrated with role playing as an activity.
Mhm.
Um, Probably with a Netflix show or two to sweeten the way to getting there. And so, Critical Role the movie or some shit like that. That kind of thing is rolling down right upon us.
Mhm.
and the aspects of crowdfunding which actually facilitate poor game design and less play rather than more are only expanding. They are only, you know, expanding. You get another fancy mess in the mail with gorgeous crap all over it and poor explanations, and then when you play, you realize that it's a fairly bad hack of a 1980s game. The
Mhm.
second you turn it into getting a thing for it, that you're ordering a
Mhm.
thing out of a catalog on a deadline, as soon as you do
Mhm.
that, it's a completely different phenomenon. And actually, what you get and what you do with it, because you've bought inclusion, you've bought presence, you've
Mhm.
bought, your right to comment, your name is in the comments, and then someone tweets about your comment. I mean, all that stuff, play and enjoyment of play is gone. This is something that concerns me, having
Mhm.
lived through it in deep contact with it.
Mhm.
Um, if we look at fantasy, horror, and science fiction, particularly before the 1990s, although the transition is very distinctive, you can see it occurring almost step by step during the 1980s. But if we look at fantasy, horror, and science fiction, you will find some very interesting things. First of all, one, the boundaries among the three are completely unconstructed. Completely.
Yeah.
In fact, there isn't even a fantasy shelf in the bookstores.
Mhm.
I mean, it's completely unconstructed. Second, the media are interactive with one another in a completely uncontrolled way. I speak specifically of books, magazines, comics, and music.
Mhm.
A great deal of fantasy, as experienced in the 70s, is through album covers. Okay, I mean these things are very integrated. The same artists across the comics, the book covers, the album covers. The same,
Yeah,
the
that's
soup, the
true.
the stuff in the comics shows up in the music unlicensed. The
Mhm.
stuff in,
Mhm.
the music becomes a novel because the guitarist decided to write a novel. Even more importantly, all of them are grounded in historical context. Whether it's set in the future, set in the far past, set in the present, it is always about the year that it's written or produced.
Mhm.
Always. But
Mhm.
also history as a reality in which we live.
Mhm.
And so to me, um, watching pop culture disconnect from that in stages and steps through the 1980s until the 1990s, when a science fiction movie is only about being a science fiction movie. It's an
Mhm.
aliens movie because it's got the aliens. And the fact that these were suddenly, the movies are now becoming, well, how am I going to put it, mass multimedia franchise
Right. Yeah.
campaigns. They're basically
Mhm.
campaigns for a given vice president to make themselves look good to stockholders or their employer. And so that's what they are. And to
Right.
be a fan of such things means to be a loyal customer. That's what being a fan becomes.
Mhm.
So
Right.
this to me is sort of painful. It means
Mhm.
that when I make a game which is a fantasy game, Circle of Hands, it is brutally grounded in my experiences of activism from 2005 through 2015,
Mhm.
as well as my childhood grounded in other activism. So, therefore, it is extraordinarily important to me in terms of its impact at that level as a fantasy game about, magic and swords and, all that stuff.
Right.
But I chose every one of those things insofar as they punctuated, accentuated, symbolized. Shpiona and Shahida are therefore closer to that way of looking at fantastic content than
Right.
it may seem. At least to me, my experience of fantastic content is
Mhm.
very grounded, and often the freakier and the more psychedelic, the better, right? So when I did Shpiona and Shahida, and in the work that I do along these lines now, yes, I have stripped it of fantastic content. but I've also stripped it of, as best as I can, and to the best of my understanding, I have stripped it of fantastic content that is not perceived as such.
Right.
If you interpret Cold War Berlin as the battleground of capitalism and communism, if you perceive, freedom versus oppression, if you buy into what John F. Kennedy said, the world cannot live half slave and half free, right, referring to these phenomena.
Mm.
Anybody who picks up Spiona and says, "Oh, a spy role-playing game," they're going to be pretty disappointed in what they see. Yeah, I mean, especially if you pick up Shahida and say, "Okay, now we will battle the terrorists." It's kind of like, this isn't that book. So,
Yeah,
in
exactly.
many ways, yes, I agree, but I'm kind of attacking that same thing. Frustrated with the separation of pop culture from history
Yeah.
in the broadest sense of history, which includes the present.
Yeah,
The
right.
separating pop culture from that, my frustration of that is, well, then, okay, here, you're going to get it naked now.
Right. I totally understand. Last question, Ron, about COVID. COVID forced us all to play online, and some newly released games are developing some tools to optimize game sessions, online sessions. Someone say there's nothing like meeting in person. I understand that, but it's undeniable that playing with people from all over the world, I mean, it can be an advantage. Is that good or not? What do you think? What's your
Well,
opinion?
there's several pieces. First of all, when I came to Sweden and I knew that I wanted to be active in Swedish role playing, the Spielenshus that I mentioned a bit ago had not started yet, and finding anybody to play with was actually quite difficult. I did have a very good time connecting with a lot of people personally, and going to GothCon was wonderful. But still, the idea of having a local group here in Norrköping and being involved with other people here was tough. Then that would change in a little while. However, I was starting up this whole Adapt to Play thing, and I had to work with the assets that I had, which was international. So that meant, as we quickly discovered, was that if we were looking at each other like we're looking at each other right now, and also, I'll say another thing. Yes, I know people have fancy backgrounds and make them kind of anonymous, like I get to see your beige ceiling right there and everything. But
Yeah, it's my
insofar as a
edit.
person is okay with it, it's kind of fun to discover that we all live in the same house, right? Every role player is, seems to have, and not always. Then we see people in other places, like a nicer or a more traditional setup and whatever. But we get to kind of, see each other's place a little bit, which sounds creepy internet wise, but not in this context. In this context, it's actually really nice. So, interestingly enough, the interpersonal interaction, the nonverbal communication, is not lost. It's different, but it's not lost, and can be, once you recognize that we really should be paying attention to each other. And even though we're not seated next to each other, if somebody makes a face, if you make a face back in response to that, they'll see it. And once you realize that happens, then everybody starts actually doing that. And you can watch people play and see all kinds of fun interactions happening. The advantage of being able to play with people in different locations. The superficial advantage is, oh, good, now I can play more. Now I don't have to worry about getting the group together. All that organization is easier rather than harder. I think it's the internationalism that matters the most. To me, that's a huge advantage. That's a huge, not an advantage. It's a benefit. This is a big deal. To be playing now. Of course, as a native English speaker, there is a sad but true hegemony at work here, right? Which is that I can play with people all over the world because they've been forced to fucking learn my language. Not that proud of this, but I think we can also say that There's always a lingua franca.
It was
complaints about that,
Latin
right?
a few years
Yeah,
ago.
there was,
so-
Exactly. I mean,
English
there
is
was
good.
one or more at any given time. So I guess, and also it can be to some extent overcome with a little bit of patience. People don't have to be experts, and they can still play very effectively. I also think that learning one another's differences or different venues for saying similar things, or learning different things about what is or isn't said, or aspects of the life. You're playing with people in Istanbul, the call to prayer comes up, and we kind of just chat for a little while instead of playing because, you know, it's loud. And, you know, then we come back to it, and playing with you know, all sorts of slightly different things, slightly different perspectives on gender, or slightly different perspectives on family. Those phenomena, to me, are tremendously valuable.
That's okay. Thank you, Ron. That was a pleasure meeting you, though on Zoom.
Take care, Paolo.
So I hope to see you soon.
Take care. Thank you.